Good morning, everybody. I decided that this morning when I got up, I walked out and decided I was going to make a video today uh, based on the number of subscribers I have and using that to look up a year in history to figure out what happened. I thought that would be fun because it's up in the 1900s realm. And when I got up and checked, it was 1918. And right away I knew what the subject matter was going to be for the video. And I thought, how perfectly coincidental to be talking about the pandemic, the influenza pandemic of 1918, during a time when everybody's afraid of this Ebola outbreak. Now, for those who don't know, in 1918 there was a major influenza outbreak, and it had mutated to a form that was more difficult to handle, more virulent, and this happens every so often. This also happened in 1890. What they found out was that the people who survived the 1890 pandemic did much well during the pandemic of 1918. And what they believe is, of course, that, when you're resistant to a certain strain of influenza, although you may get a different form of the virus, you may be resistant to certain components of it. It's one of those things. I'm definitely not too well versed in the details about the flu itself, but I thought that this would be kind of a fun thing to cover. I shouldn't say fun. Let me start out with the Ebola outbreak thing. I'm not afraid of this Ebola outbreak at all. I have absolutely no doubt that this will be contained. Okay, I'm not going to say I have no doubt. I'm going to say that I'm 90% sure that this will be contained and will go on to live in history as another Ebola or another SARS, another outbreak of something. If you look back to SARS, that was just the funniest thing to me. People were afraid of SARS, and I'm like, even then I wasn't afraid of SARS, and back then I was in this mode of, being paranoid about the end of the world kind of thing. So I've since grown out of that and realized that, it's almost like we're waiting for a pandemic to take us out. It's almost like we're waiting for the shit to hit the fan so we can all go, haha, I knew it, And I know that not everybody feels that way, but that's how I feel like a lot of folks are. Like, they're just waiting for an outbreak. And I'm kind of on that. I'm not waiting for it in a positive sense. I don't want it to happen, but I have a feeling it might. But I'm not likely to think that it's Ebola. I'm much more likely to think that it's something that we don't expect, and it's going to pop up out of nowhere. So, let me just read you this interesting little clip. This is from the pandemic history, flu.gov. I know people don't like government websites, but hey, not everything's a lie. How did physicians and scientists understand influenza in 1918? And this is, I'm going to wrap this up with something, my point about doctors and modern technology, but during the mid to late 19th century, physicians and scientists had begun to understand that diseases are caused by microorganisms. This was a radical departure from the traditional medical theories, which had held that diseases were caused by miasmas, or an imbalance in the body's humors. Building on this new understanding of the disease, scientists and physicians achieved incredible success identifying 50 causative agents of diseases ranging from typhoid, tuberculosis, cholera, plague, and malaria between 1880 and 1920. Sorry, I just woke up. In 1918, most physicians and scientists mistakenly believed that influenza was caused by a bacteria, not a virus, called Pfeiffer's bacillus. This bacteria had been first identified as the cause of influenza by Robert Frederick Pfeiffer, a leading German scientist. Although Pfeiffer had failed to provide definitive proof that this bacillus actually caused influenza, few scientists actually question his claims. Now, isn't that just funny? Isn't that just the history of medicine? You know, a scientist declares something and everybody just kind of follows suit. It says, in the midst of the pandemic, however, this theory came under attack. Researchers performing autopsies on influenza victims reported over and over again that they had failed to locate the bacillus. Attempts to infect healthy patients with influenza by injecting them with Pfeiffer's bacillus also failed to cause influenza. And most early 20th century physicians were familiar with influenza and its symptoms. Where's the part? Oh yeah, I wanted to see the... oh, here we go. Before the advent of antibiotics in the 1940s, practitioners had only a limited ability to treat diseases. Moreover, even if antibiotics had been available in 1918, which they were not, a viral disease such as influenza could not have been treated by the drugs. There was this funny thing in here. Anyway, I can't remember where it was. They would wrap people in blankets and they would have them sweat it out, and then they would do like blood cupping, stuff like that. Now this is in the late 1800s, and even into the early 1900s and mid 1900s. All of these different places trying these different shock treatment therapies, and it was a really horrible time for people to be insane. Let's put it this way. From the late 1800s, especially into the mid 1900s, and even today, if a person was even deemed to be slightly crazy, you could just drop them off at the nut house, and they'd just be an experiment, basically. In fact, up until I think the 50s, and still in some places, a man could take his wife and drop her off at the psych ward and just declare that she is hysterical, and they would take her, and women would never make it out. It's horrible. It's horrible. So anyway, what I'm trying to do is kind of tie in our foolish past and our medical past, to look back at how the doctors saw things even 100 years ago, and to think, now today, how much better off are we at treating these diseases, these viruses, these bacteria, all these different problems? Sure, we have antibiotics, but are we really any closer to, you know, solving problems like the flu or the common cold? So, so that's 1918, you know, less than 100 years ago. And I imagine at the time people thought that the world was coming to an end. I mean, there have been end-of-the-world scenarios going on forever, and we always manage to make it out. And I don't know if in today's world we're going to be able to have the same degree of success. It's obvious that a pandemic in 1918 was carried over in boats. I mean, people weren't flying to work across seas back then. But it was brought in boats. It's much longer. It was easier to quarantine. These days, if somebody catches something, they are from New York to London, Paris, in a few days, and it's spread everywhere. So my fear isn't necessarily... My fear of a disease would be a slow-spreading disease that takes a long time to really take hold. Something that might take 2 weeks to a month to actually work through the system to where you notice you even have it. And at that point, we're all doomed. I mean, because anything that is quick acting is easy to corner, you know. You can put a person in isolation for a couple days, and if they're okay, you know, they're fine. But it's a very, it's a scary time to live in the regards to disease, because, well, because of the obvious things, the obvious reasons. I mean, I don't know if the guy I meet, shake hands with at the grocery store, was in Africa last week. You know, I don't know if he's got Ebola. You know, I don't know what people have been doing. Like that guy that showed up in Texas. I just heard about it. I didn't look at the story, but he didn't even tell them that he'd been working with Ebola patients in Africa. And I remember my mom mentioned it to me, and I don't know if that's the actual story, but I guess he was in Texas and he didn't tell them that he'd been working with Ebola patients. And she's like, well, don't you think that would be the first thing you'd tell them? My mom said this, and I said, actually, that'd be the last thing you'd tell them. Because if you're an American You just want to get home to your family. You've been working hard across seas, regardless of what you're doing. I can see why a person would keep their mouth shut. They just assume, well, I'm okay, I feel alright, I'm not going to, if I say anything, they're going to put me in quarantine, and I just want to get home. So it's a selfish notion. It's a very selfish thing. People don't want to tell others that they're sick. So we can't trust each other to know, and be honest and say, yeah, I think I'm sick, I better keep myself out of the public view. So being a guy that has a kid, has 3 kids and one of them in kindergarten, it makes it hard too, because I keep an eye on any viral outbreaks, and if anything major happens here, I'm pulling them out of school. I don't want to risk that. My wife's a waitress at a restaurant. She works with people who have been all over the place. Who knows where they've been, and so dealing with people in the public eye, you are much more susceptible to these things. But we can't just hide. And we can't just wait for something to take us out. And I guess that's really where I want to tie this up, with the idea of, first off, if we could acknowledge that we have the ability to do the research ourselves and do our own science as far as which medications, herbs work for these viruses, pandemics, outbreaks, bacterias, different things that we get. We trust our doctors to give us the medication that we need. A lot of us don't, but a lot of people do. More people do, I think, trust their doctors than don't. And they're limited by their scope of education. I'm not sure if this is true anymore. This is just something I heard, so I'm going to refer it as speculation or hearsay. But somebody told me once that in order to receive a doctorate, you only need to take an 8-hour course in nutrition. So with all the schooling, all the years of schooling, there's a very, very small window of education about actual foods. And I think that this is because of the fact that we rely more on medicines than foods, and because we don't know as much about foods as we'd like to know. And most of all, that foods are hard to break down into their components to understand the synergy of how these things and the compounds work against diseases, viruses. In other words, the number one preventative measure you can take against getting sick is eating properly. And I think we all know this, but not many of us do. And most of us are immersed in a society where we're forced to eat things that are not so healthy for us. And yes, we can make the choice to go to Whole Foods and to cook these healthy meals, but we don't. We don't. All of us. I don't. So, I think that knowing that the doctors don't have that much of an education on food leaves it open to interpretation, but for us, it means that we need to do a little bit of our own research and figure out what works. There are a lot of websites where people go to post, hey, this is a homeopathic remedy, and then there's plenty of people to tear it down and say homeopathy sucks, it's total garbage, we need modern medicine. There's no sense in arguing or debating with people over your personal path to health, but I just think that we need to think a little simpler, in other words. We're creating phenomenal drugs. The medical world has created amazing things. And I know there's a huge battle about vaccines and whatnot. I did my research on vaccines. I don't get a flu shot. I refuse to. I won't get my kids flu shots, but certain vaccines are beneficial. They have brought our mortality rate down and allowed us to actually live healthier lives without worrying about previously debilitating things like polio. But along that path, there's been a lot of arrogance that people have carried with them, assuming that every one of their vaccines is great and that every one of their medicines is great. And we all know that's not true. You can look at the side effects on any medicine and be like, man, that's not for me. Even the longest enduring medicines, have major side effects. I think it's Valium, People have been taking that for anxiety for years. I took Valium for a long time. The addiction is strong, And so these medicines that we take aren't always medicines. Sometimes they just cover up the problem. In fact, most of the time they cover up the problem. So if we're going to deal with a pandemic and an outbreak, just set yourself aside from the government, from all the others who are creating these, these medicines and vaccines, you know, and just know that you're not going to get a hold of any Tamiflu, that kind of stuff. And so, you know, just be aware of what's going on. Keep yourself. There's an RSOE website which shows any outbreaks. It's the emergency response website. It's a good thing to keep up on so you can see your local areas, and just be aware and don't be afraid. Don't let it scare you. And just, I wouldn't worry about Ebola myself, but I know that there are a lot of people out here who are very concerned about that. Ebola just doesn't seem like it has too quick of an onset time to really be a danger to the world at large. It could easily take out a large population, but we'd quickly quarantine and stop that. You know, it might send us into a depression by doing it, cutting down air traffic, whatever, but we have methods to doing this. And eventually it would get under control. So there have always been outbreaks, and there will always be outbreaks. And hopefully we don't get the one that wipes us all out. But if we do, at least be aware and try to work with natural medicines if you can. If you can. Take care, everybody.